Okay. I want to talk about the halacha, or the prohibition against living in Egypt, and unfortunately, I don't have my paper. Yeah, it was a little awkward. I did before the session, but like whatever, you know, let bygones be bygones. So I want to talk about that, and it struck me as very odd because when we, sort of compartmentalize the events of Pesach, and we think about who really wronged us, who really got those 10 plagues, it wasn't the Egyptians as a people. When Jews think about people who we don't like, we really hold one major grudge. It's one major grudge, because it's Amalek, right? We never say Mitzrayim, we say Amalek. They didn't play by the rules. But the Mitzrayim, the way Egypt's portrayed in the Torah, it's not always so bad, right? We all know the Joseph story, and it's depicted as a country that, is relatively welcoming to the Jewish people, where Joseph wasn't able to, arise to great heights, and it didn't matter if he was a Jew. And the Torah actually furthers this idea by saying, when did all the trouble start? When God hardened Pharaoh's heart, right? It wasn't even, it wasn't even a natural, organic phenomenon. God had to intervene in order to make Egypt a bad place. So keeping this in mind, why is it that we're not allowed to live in Egypt, right? So let's first look at where it says we're not allowed to live in Egypt. And I'm sorry that I have to quote from my iPhone. But in fact, at the most pivotal moment of the Exodus story, one could say, as Moshe is with Bnei Israel on the banks of the Red Sea, he says to them the following: "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see God's salvation that he will wreak for you today. For the way you have seen the Egyptians is only today, but you shall no longer continue to see them for eternity." So, you're not going to even ever see the Egyptians again in your life. And this idea is perpetuated in Dvarim, where a king has said that he can't have many horses because if he has horses, he's going to be tempted to go back to Egypt and deal. Yeah, I like interacting with our Torahs and trade with the Egyptians, and that of course would be tragic. And then again later on in Dvarim, one of the last chapters where the Sefer recounts a bunch of curses. One of the big curses is, if you screw up, I'm going to send you to Egypt, the place where I said you couldn't go.
That implies that you're not allowed to live there?
Right. So that begets the question, we just had a whole day devoted to the Jewish community living in Egypt. And even more that, the Jewish community in Egypt is known for producing some of the great rabbinic minds of this day. And certainly if I was able to read these 3 psukim, they were too, and probably, frankly, really care about them a lot. So, again, how could we reconcile the contradiction of Jews for millennium living in Egypt? So,
I'm no scholar, but you know.
Yeah. So, and on another note, there's even more concrete evidence of why living in Egypt is bad, because the Gemara in Sukkah recounts a story of, the Jews from the northern kingdom left for Egypt. They were killed, and the Jews, before the first temple, and they were assimilated. The Jews from the second temple, they left before, and they were also killed. So Egypt is no good. So, again, this all contradicts the fact that people like the Rambam, the Ramaz, and the Arizal, who was born in Egypt, talked about the Egyptian Jewish community being a great place. So, Rabbi Eliezer ben Shmuel, who was a Tosaphist, taught that the law refers to going from Israel to Egypt exclusively. So he saw that as problematic because it would essentially be a complete affront to God, saying, God, you took us out of Egypt and brought us to your holy land of Israel, which is what we'll say in a couple nights. I'm going to go from the holy land of Israel to Egypt. Right? There are some other opinions. The Ramaz explains that it only refers to people living permanently in Egypt, and if you plan to live there temporarily or for business or for asylum, which actually has some of the most historical precedent, it's okay. And lastly, the Arizal explains that in a more Kabbalistic interpretation, which is his nature, that a Jew's obligation when they live wherever they live is to try to attempt to bring out some sort of, metaphysical sense of holiness out of the place, which is an awfully obscure idea, but he insists that when the Jews lived in Egypt, they had removed all the inherent holiness from that ground. Again, it's more of a spiritual, philosophical idea that's consistent with the Arizal, and so it would never make any sense for a Jew to live in Egypt because the holiness was already out. So, I don't know whether you guys like that or not, but I can tell you who didn't like it, and I'll close on this. The Rambam, who also had, obviously had a tremendous halachic background, didn't subscribe to all these. But for whatever reason, for a large part of his life, he lived in Egypt and rose to incredible heights in Egyptian society. And even though one would think he had a great time there, because it certainly seems like that to me, every single note he wrote to people, he'd sign his name, like, thanks a lot, like, nice talking to you, Rambam, and then he'd write, and then he'd make a little dash, and he'd call himself the one who transgresses 3 commandments every single day, which goes back to the psukim I talked about, those 3 psukim in the Torah, which talk about the prohibition against living in Egypt. So, what we can take from this is probably the following. Us being people who straddle the divide between, the secular world and the religious world, which is what Ramaz is all about, may often, unfortunately, find ourselves in situations where we can't necessarily live in the most halachically way possible. Right? I mean, we've all been at times where, it's hard, and that was the Rambam's particular situation. But nevertheless, what we can learn from it is no matter what the instance and no matter what the difficulties, one should always live with the recognition of the higher purpose and the Torah. So, thank you.